Filipinos are taught to work hard in school, get good grades, and make their family proud. But never get too educated, because then you become a problem. America is often credited for bringing their public education system to the Philippines in the early 1900s. But the goal wasn't to make Filipinos smarter. It was to convince the Filipino people that this new colonizer, aka America, is different from European colonizers. No, these American colonizers are benevolent, bringing public education and healthcare into the country.
And so American education did what it intended to do: stop Filipino uprisings, culturally assimilate us into American values, and train us to be a compliant labor force, not for the Philippines, but for the global economy, especially the US. And it worked. Today, when a Filipino gets educated, the reward is often to leave.
We even have a name for it: brain drain.
And it was the title of my first book, Migrants, for export. All this is tied to our history of Filipino education, a history class that you most likely have never taken, not in the Philippines nor America.
But long before this, Filipino Studies, a field within ethnic studies, struggled to find funding and support. Meanwhile, in America today, we can see exactly how those in power continue to view education. Donald Trump has signed numerous executive orders that ultimately aim to dismantle the Department of Education, claiming that K-12 schools are promoting radical indoctrination and anti-American ideologies.
So is the Philippine education system better because America got involved?
Does America even want Filipinos to study our native languages and histories?
And if we consider the education system for Filipinos to be broken,
what can we do about it?
I'm Dr. Robin Rodriguez, founder of the School for Liberating Education.
I'm Leo Albea, and this is One Down, where we redefine Filipino.
American education in the Philippines started with the Thomasites. In 1901, the U.S. sent around 600 American teachers aboard a ship called the Thomas to formally launch the civilian public school system in the Philippines.
These young, idealistic teachers were handpicked from over 40 states and are what scholars have described as maternal agents of empire. They were expected to raise Filipinos into obedient colonial subjects, with the curriculum focus on English, math, agriculture, trade skills, and home economics. None of this education included Filipino history, indigenous knowledge, or self-governance. They did not build a generation of nation builders. Instead, they trained Filipinos for labor, English-speaking, and employable. This American approach to education actually came from the Hampton-Tuskegee model, a system originally built for formerly enslaved African Americans in the South after the Civil War. The system operated under the belief that people of color should be taught manual skills, not critical thinking, so that they are trained for usefulness, not leadership. However, the US offered different tracks for different Filipinos. Catholics were taught to read and write to help administer the colony, whereas Muslim and indigenous communities were given manual training in order to civilize them. This approach reflected America's deep racial hierarchy. One of the most powerful tools in this strategy was language, which is why English became the only acceptable language in schools. Historians describe English as becoming the wedge that separated the Filipinos from their past and then from each other. The more educated you became in that system, the further you drifted from your roots, including your native tongue and oral histories. The US also handpicked the most promising Filipino students and sent them to study in elite American universities through the Pensionado program launched in 1903. These American-educated Filipinos became the loyal and professional intellectuals that would return home to the Philippines to maintain the system of American economic dominance, even after independence.
The Americanization of Philippine education was for economic extraction, building a labor force that served American commercial interests, not Filipino self-determination.
So, when people ask why Filipino students feel disconnected from their culture or why working abroad is considered the dream, part of the answer is here. It was planted in the classroom over 100 years ago. The Americanization of Filipino education didn't stop in the Philippines. It continued right here in the US. For decades, Filipino American students have had to fight to see themselves represented in the curriculum.
Ethnic studies as a field didn't come from universities. It came from protest. In 1968, students at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley launched the longest student strikes in U.S. history, demanding that communities of color finally be taught their own histories. Filipino students led the charge. A group called PACE, Filipino American Collegiate Endeavor, was part of the coalition that founded the first School of Ethnic Studies in the country. By the early 1970s, the ethnic studies movement expanded to include many other ethnic groups, from Native Americans, Chicanos, and by 1973, nearly 600 ethnic studies programs and departments were created across the U.S. The foundation of ethnic studies was designed to educate and empower community activists to create positive social change rooted in challenging oppression. It really embodies the saying, no history, no self.
While Filipinos were involved in the ethnic studies movement, the study of our own history has faced an uphill battle in establishing itself within academic institutions.
I was actually brought into UC Davis as a Filipino Studies scholar. I'm probably best known for my leadership in founding the Bulosan Center for Filipinic Studies. It was the very first of its kind to be established in the University of California system, probably even nationally. I remember having a meeting with the dean early on, making the argument that it was time for the University of California system to establish a center focused on Filipino studies. I was told by the dean's office, if we open that door, we can't close it. If we support Filipinos only, then every other group will want to get support. And of course, the university doesn't have infinite resources. Meanwhile, my argument was, Filipinos aren't just any group. Filipinos are the only country in Asia that had been colonized by the United States. That is a very distinctive relationship that makes Filipinos important. One of the fastest growing and largest, oldest populations of Asian ethnics in California. That still fell on deaf ears. So in 2013, then Assembly Member, now Attorney General of California, Rob Bonta had introduced a piece of legislation called AB 123, mandated the teaching of Filipinos' contribution to the farm worker struggle in K-12 education. The problem was the scholarship, the research on Larry Itliong, on Philip Maricruz, on any number of Filipino leaders in the farm worker struggle had not been done. Well, what was a teacher in the K-12 teacher going to teach if there weren't resources available to them? Fortunately, in 2013, the California Humanities was supportive when I had put in a proposal for this oral history project. We systematically went to talk to, again, the elders that were still alive, because many had already passed. And so we created this archive called the Welga Archive. But in the process, we were meeting lots and lots of people in the community. So every time I was collecting an oral history or getting access to some other kind of archival material, we were simultaneously trying to create curriculum. So that was going on for several years till the grant funding ran out. But you know what? Why don't we just try to do it the Manong way? The Manongs would pool their money. Even the Agbayani villages, retirement village, was built from the ground up. That was all our community coming together. And that was inspiring. I said, if we could buy buildings back in the day when, it was predominantly low-wage working Manongs, we could establish Filipino studies at a university. Let's just try. And so I figured out how to create a fundraising portal at UC Davis. We organized this major fundraising dinner, and eventually Assembly Member Rob Bonta supported us in advocating in the Capitol. The advocacy work that I helped to lead brought us $1 million from the state of California. And the reason why the university doesn't like this is that we become, in effect, a competitor of UCOP, the UC Office of the President. They lobby at the state capitol yearly to increase the state allocation for the UC system as a whole. When you are a tiny little unit and you sort of do an end run around, and if you're successful, what that means is it reduces the amount of money. State legislature says, well, okay, we can fund some of that, but we have other people connected to your system who we actually want to support. So we are going to take some of that UC money for them, then what you're going to have to work with whatever's left. And I didn't know this. I just thought I was doing a good thing for our students, our community. And by 2020, with the global lockdown and the pandemic, I think that's really where I started to see the full ugliness of the university. And meanwhile, the Bulosan Center, we were responding, pushing out research, trying to highlight the ways that the Filipino community was being impacted by COVID, holding space for students from throughout the country. I think the thing that really put me over the edge, frankly, was the personal loss, the loss of my eldest son, Amado Kaya, while he was working with indigenous communities in the Philippines in August 2020. I've already lost a lot in my life, and I don't trust this institution. I'm just going to jump. I'm going to take everything I built at UC Davis with me, and I'm going to try to recreate them, but on our terms, around the values we have as a community, and start things anew. And so that's where we are today. Through the Bulosan Center, through my investment in an academic journal that features the latest and greatest research among Filipino Studies scholars, invested in the only book series focused on Filipino studies. I did that. I didn't do it alone, but I visioned it. I gathered the people around me so that these things could be out into the world.
And maybe that's the point. If schools won't teach Filipino history the way our communities need, then the community has to teach itself. That's why One Down partnered with the School for Liberating Education, because we believe Filipino education shouldn't just survive in institutions that ignore us. It should live where our people already are. So we created a new course called Mastering the Filipino American Market, a 6-week experience designed to help Filipino entrepreneurs reach our community through compelling Filipino content and effective campaigns that scale. There was no playbook for building Filipino media through One Down, so we created one. Go to buildfilipino.com or apply at the link below. Despite setbacks, students continue to lead the charge of learning our own history and languages, all the way up to some of the most prestigious schools in the US, the Ivy League. Harvard University introduced its first ever Tagalog course in 2023, followed by Yale, who is set to launch its own Tagalog program in September 2025. Meanwhile, Brown University students are currently pushing for a program and have gathered over 1,000 signatures of support, with Princeton students also advocating for a Tagalog language program. While these developments represent a moving progress towards a comprehensive Filipino studies program, this growing demand in Tagalog amplifies the broader call for stronger Filipino representation in higher education, and especially emphasizes the importance of language in education. While students continue to advocate to see their histories in the curriculum, they continue to organize education themselves through independent courses called GISPs, or Group Independent Study Projects, which have included Tagalog and Filipino cultural history since the early 2000s. A great example that when schools don't teach our history, we learn how to tell it ourselves.
But then that begs the question, does Filipino education belong in the university or in the community?
So who controls Filipino education today, and is it working? In the Philippines, education is now run by 3 national agencies: the Department of Education, or DepEd, for basic education, the Commission on Higher Education for colleges and universities, and TESDA for vocational training. But in practice, DepEd has the most power, governing over 28 million students and 800,000 teachers through a deeply centralized system. While this may sound efficient, it actually becomes a huge bottleneck. The Philippines is actually now considered one of the most centralized education systems in the world, but this centralization has consequences. In 2018, the Philippines ranked last in reading and nearly last in math and science out of 79 countries based on the PISA Global Education Rankings. In national exams, 9 out of 10 grade 5 students could not comprehend what they read. And this can be narrowed down to 3 key points. 1. Excessive centralization, where authority is concentrated at the national level, making it unresponsive to local needs, as only 3 authorities can sign off on decisions across the entire system: the Secretary of Education, regional superintendents, and school principals, which means that local classroom improvements can be delayed simply because a memo from the top hasn't been issued yet. 2. Lack of accountability, where public officials are not held accountable for educational outcomes because the system lacks any effective mechanisms to do so. And 3. Inadequate local participation, where communities and parents do not have a meaningful involvement in educational governance. All of this contributes to a system where there is a shortage of 165,000 classrooms, 5,000 schools that lack electricity, 10,000 lack access to water, and a major shortage of teachers. Philippine education today ultimately does its job of training students to work abroad, rather than empowering them to think critically and build locally.
Scholars label this as miseducation, or rather, an education that disconnects you from your own history, so you never learn how to lead your own country. Education is an export pipeline to prepare students to become overseas workers rather than civic leaders. And in the US as well, Filipino studies remain limited, surviving mainly through student protest and community-funded workarounds.
And so, why do we have the worst Filipino education in the world? Because education is never neutral. Again, this goes back to education as a strategic tool to shape beliefs, loyalties, and labor.
It either prepares you to serve someone else or to help you build your own. As it exists today, it's meant to serve external interests, not Filipino futures.
And so, if you're educated on this,
On the history of Filipino education and American involvement, what will we do next?
to genuinely educate our community. If you made it to the end of this video, you already know how broken the education system is for Filipinos. That's why we built something different with our new course,
Mastering the Filipino American Market.
It's for Filipino founders, creatives, and changemakers who want to grow their business and their impact without waiting for institutions to catch up.
Each week, I'll walk you through how class, geography, gender, and culture shape Filipino buying decisions.
Apply now at buildfilipino.com. And if you believe in what we're building, subscribe to our channel and drop a comment with your reflections. Salamat, and we'll see you in the next video.